Hello, we're live. Maybe that should be my new thing. I'll walk to the chair as it's coming on. It'll be like a Mr. Rogers thing. Welcome, everyone, to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers. I am a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for so very, very many reasons. This is just an open conversation to talk about whatever. Every week we pick a topic. The topic this week is late diagnosis of ADHD or autism in adulthood. We can talk about any diagnosis, but those are the ones that we have questions about, and we have a bunch of questions. But if you're here, you take priority. If you're here in the chat and you want to ask questions or take the conversation in a different direction, we'll go where you want to go. Man, I hate that StreamYard doesn't mirror my... It makes me so self-conscious. Yeah, questions, comments, whatever. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you watching this after the fact. We are going to be making a shift relatively soon, maybe as early as next week, to doing this stream at a different time, different day. But we will still do rebroadcasts of the stream at this time for those of you who can't make it to whatever other time. I'll give you more details on that as I get them. I run a therapy and executive functioning coaching practice called Effective Artistry in the suburbs of Chicago. That's our logo up there in the corner. We do individual, couples, family, group therapy, and we do individual executive functioning coaches. We have therapists and we have coaches separately. Yeah, I don't know. That seems good. I gotta say, I'm trying, and we'll see. I might stop it at some point, but for the first time ever in my life, I have active noise canceling headphones. I just got them yesterday, and so I'm trying them right now to see. It is a very noticeable difference. And of course, lots of people talk a lot about the noise canceling and auditory sensitivities and things. It is a noticeable difference, and it's interesting, but it is very different. So it draws my attention, and maybe that'll be too distracting for me while we're doing this, and I might pop them out, but I just kind of wanted to see what it's like. Yeah, that seems like most of the important stuff, so we'll just get going. So the topic today is late diagnosis of ADHD and or autism in adulthood. We've got a bunch of questions this week. Cool. Let me just see here. What are the early signs of untreated ADHD or autism in adults, men versus women? What types of therapy or therapeutic interventions are most beneficial for individuals who receive a late diagnosis in adulthood? Is it more difficult to receive medication for ADHD when diagnosed later in adulthood? Is it normal for adults with a late diagnosis to receive accommodations at their current workplace? How do I go about telling my neurotypical partner that I am now diagnosed with autism? Can symptoms of ADHD become more or less manageable when entering adulthood? Are the individuals who have adult onset of ADHD neurobiologically and genetically different than individuals who have ADHD that emerges up to age 12? In your opinion, what would be the best way to diagnose ADHD and or autism in adults? Do you think depression or anxiety in adulthood could be directly linked if you are undiagnosed with the condition? What are the most common differential diagnoses? How to work with your healthcare practitioner, seek a second opinion if you think you've been misdiagnosed. There's practical management of symptoms, traits while awaiting a diagnosis, pros and cons of stimulant medication for ADHD, reasons to consider non-stimulant or non-medical, and what are the reasons that women and girls appear to be underdiagnosed? Interesting. Some good questions. Okay, so let's set the framework at the beginning here and talk about diagnosis, because diagnosis has very limited utility when it comes to these particular conditions, but also just kind of generally, especially for people who have gotten into adulthood undiagnosed. Because, especially when it comes to neurodivergent conditions or neurotypes or ways of being, we talk a lot about self-identification. Some people will use the term self-diagnosis. I prefer self-identification because it's somebody's identifying that a label seems to apply to them. It is useful for them to consider themselves as qualifying for a particular label. And of course, what that means to everybody is different. And so you'll get pushback from some people who are saying that self-identification is bad or harmful or inappropriate. I am a fan of self-identification. A lot of these questions are specifically about the process of getting diagnosed, like a clinical diagnosis by a diagnostic professional, right? So the first thing before we get into any of that is if you are considering getting a diagnosis or pursuing a potential diagnosis, ask yourself why. Because there are limited benefits. There are some, but they are limited. The benefit of getting diagnosis mostly falls into three categories, and one of which you get self-identification, one of which doesn't matter to you. So the first would be having a diagnosis gives you different language with which to interact with yourself and with which to express and communicate about yourself with other people. In other words, if you are diagnosed as autistic, or if you self-identify as autistic, you can now use that lens as a way to look at your own experience through the lens of being an autistic person, and how does that affect you. You can find communities of autistic people and share resources and learn from other people who have been through similar things. Now, of course, each individual is a unique individual. Even if two people have an official diagnosis of autism, they're different people, and the things that apply for one aren't necessarily going to apply for another, but it's a higher hit rate. There is something in common, right? That even though you're unique, there are overlaps if you are both autistic. And those overlaps mean that things that you hear, advice that you get, stories that you tell are more likely to be relatable or relevant to you or to the people that you're talking to. You can find books and podcasts and streaming shows and all different kinds of things to look for resources in that way. And you can use that language as a way to be able to communicate with others. None of that requires an official diagnosis. That's the stuff that you can get with the self-identification. Having said that, some people will not consider your diagnosis valid unless it is an official diagnosis, meaning if you self-identify as ADHD or autistic, some people will say, no, you don't get to do that. You need to be diagnosed by a medical professional. Second benefit is access to treatment or interventions that are, I was going to say gate kept, but that are locked behind an official diagnosis. In other words, while you can actually get a prescription for ADHD medication, for example, without an official diagnosis, it is very difficult. It's much more likely that you'll get it with an official diagnosis. If you're looking for accommodations from your workplace, your school, any large organization, it may be that those places will give accommodations, but only with official diagnosis. So that category is the one that you will sometimes at least need an official diagnosis. I would hope that some places will give accommodations just because they're reasonable and flexible and they don't need you to go through a process of documenting and proving the necessity. I hope that spreads more and more. That's something I work on when I do presentations at different corporations and things like that. Because adding that bar is unhelpful to pretty much everybody involved in the process. But especially if you're in school, for the most part, they're going to want some kind of official documentation, in large part because schools have very limited resources to help provide additional or modified support for people. And they're titrating. They're trying to give it to, or not titrating, they're triaging. They're trying to allocate their resources for support to the people who need it the most. Now, does that correlate with who has the official diagnosis? Not at all, but that's the way that they use it. The third thing that is beneficial about diagnostic categories is nothing to do with you as an individual. It's just that that's how we can study things. We can find patterns. We can experiment with different treatments and interventions. We need to be able to have a population of people who do not have the diagnosis and a population of people who officially have a diagnosis so that we can run research and all that kind of stuff. And that doesn't matter for you. So ask yourself why you're pursuing an official diagnosis, because if it isn't for that second category, the category of needing something official documentation or paperwork in order to unlock accommodations or treatment or interventions or resources, if you don't need that, then I would highly, highly recommend that you reconsider whether or not pursuing an official diagnosis is worth doing, because it's not typically easy or enjoyable, and it is very likely to be traumatizing. It's not a fun or good process for most people to go through as adults, especially. In particular for ADHD and autism, which are diagnostic categories that have been almost exclusively applied to children until very, very recently, including the myth, the idea that people grow out of these conditions when they become adults. That's still a very widespread belief that ADHD is something kids have, and then when you turn 18, you magically are somehow a different person. For that reason, well, maybe this will come up in some of the questions, but for that reason, it can be very difficult and traumatizing to go in, for example, for a neuropsych assessment, if the neuropsych assessor is somebody who doesn't really think that adults should or could or need to be or qualify for being diagnosed with one of these things, because it is quite likely then that they will identify in their reasoning that you are just somebody who is seeking an excuse for their struggles or access to some medication that isn't actually necessary for them, and they go in with a bias. I've seen it many times come out in the neuropsych reports, including in my own, where it'll come back saying basically, nope, they don't struggle the way that they think they struggle, and also they think they're super awesome and they want an excuse for all of their own behavior. It can be awful. Now, hopefully you find an assessor who is not that, but especially if you're going through your insurance, you will only have so much to choose from. It is possible to get misdiagnosed, undiagnosed. It is possible to have things ruled out. It's tread lightly. I don't recommend doing it. Right. But insurance requires it for meds, Adderall. There's no workaround. So yeah, that's what I'm saying. If it's that second category of you need a treatment or an intervention, you need something unlocked for you, and you need an official diagnosis, then you do have to go through it. And that's what we're going to be talking about, is the process of getting an official diagnosis. I just wanted to put this out there in advance of all that, of really think about whether it is costly. It is, especially if you are undiagnosed and an adult, it is likely that you will not get a diagnosis, and that you'll get some other diagnosis is a possibility, or that you're invalidated in your way of dealing with yourself, understanding yourself. And I'll say, I don't know all the specific details. I don't know if it's different states or different insurance companies. From what I understand, doctors are able to prescribe Adderall and Vyvanse and whatever things, and insurance will pay for it if doctors prescribe it without needing a full neuropsych workup necessarily, but it depends on the doctor. And that might not be the case everywhere. Okay. So there's all that. What are the early signs of untreated ADHD and or autism in adults, men versus women? Well, so we're talking specifically about a particular population, which is people who have ADHD and or are autistic, but have not been diagnosed as children, because that narrows things down a little bit. There are reasons that people might go undiagnosed. Less access to resources is definitely one of those, but also some level of success in masking or compensating for whatever disrupting symptoms that person is experiencing. In other words, if you have been undiagnosed through your entire childhood, school career, then it's likely that you have figured out ways of getting through the things that you're being asked to do. Because if you had been struggling and melting down in some kind of more visible way, it's more likely that they would have that you would have been identified as being ADHD or autistic. So know that what we're talking about a lot of the time, early signs of untreated ADHD, autism in adults, we're not talking about early signs, because you're an adult, and this isn't something that just happened all of a sudden. These are not acquired conditions. These are just ways of being from the jump. In fact, in the diagnostic criteria, because these are officially, we're going to focus on official diagnostic criteria, meaning this good, fun, I'm being sarcastic, book right here, the DSM-5, which lists all of the specific symptoms and diagnostic criteria that must be present in order for an official diagnosis to be applied to a person. Because they're neurodevelopmental disorders, they require that the symptoms, that the experiences or observations that are related to these conditions have to have been present before age 3. And again, this is part of the reason that getting a diagnosis as an adult can be difficult and even traumatizing, because if they're going to give that diagnosis, it's quite likely that they'll want to speak with, most likely, your parents, which you may not have as an option because they want to get information about what was going on with you before you were 3 years old. Because if those same symptoms appear later in life but weren't present, they're going to assign it to a different diagnosis, most likely. Because they're neurodevelopmental, it means they must have occurred at certain stages in the developmental process and affected the developmental process. So we're not talking about early signs, but some signs that you might have ADHD or be autistic. Yeah. Overthinking and anxiety, social anxiety in particular, trouble getting started, initiating on tasks, staying organized, tracking things in working memory, all the various things that I would assume most of us are already associating with ADHD and autism. If you're experiencing those things, actually, again, let me be real clear here. Diagnosis, official diagnosis of disorders listed in the DSM is based purely on symptomatic expression, nothing else. There is no consideration of what we would call etiology, meaning the root cause of something, as opposed to medicine. And I want to be clear about this. I talk about this a lot. This is not medicine. Nothing about this. It seems like it, it sounds like it, and there is an overlap in the psychiatric community who are medical doctors as well as therapists. But these are disorders. They're not diseases. They're specifically named that way. Those mean different things. And this is one of those pieces of language that most people just don't know much about or pay much attention to, that all gets disorder, disease, syndrome, whatever. It's all the same thing. It's not. Disorders are about disordered behavior or experience, meaning we're drawing a circle, a boundary around what we consider ordered behavior, orderly behavior, which is culturally dependent, and anything that falls outside of that would be disordered. It is not something where, like in medicine, we look at the mechanism of what is happening. In other words, you go to your doctor and say, I'm experiencing this symptom, this symptom, this symptom. They say, I think that might be diabetes. And then they run a test which can tell us if it's diabetes or not, because we have ways of observing what specifically is happening that counts as diabetes or not. This, we don't have that. There is no test. There's no way to look inside your brain or your body anywhere and observe visually or there's no way to observe what the mechanism internally is. Anything that people have talked about regarding the mechanisms is all theoretical, whether they're talking about genetics, epigenetics, friggin' Simon Baron-Cohen's, extremely male brain theory. They're all just people's theories about why we observe patterns, and we find it useful and valid to label those patterns. It seems like there are certain people who experience this thing and this thing and this thing and also this thing. So we see these patterns and we label them. It's useful to do so. And people who qualify, who match those patterns, respond statistically similarly to similar stimuli. Doesn't mean that any given individual, some people with ADHD, in fact, quite a few, a large percentage of people with ADHD are not helped by ADHD medication. That doesn't mean they don't have ADHD. So these are collections of symptoms. If you look in the DSM, which is the only place that makes these things official categories, right? There is no official diagnosis, for example, of being shy. That's just a word that we use to describe ourselves or other people when it seems useful to do so. These are official diagnostic categories for the medical system and the insurance system. This is the only book that stipulates that, meaning if they update this book and they remove autism, for example, from the book, it is no longer going to be considered a diagnosable condition. Homosexuality used to be in a version of this book. It was a diagnosable condition with medical approaches to treatment. They got rid of that back in the 70s. This is a changing thing, and it's based on culture. some interesting things in here, by the way. Delayed sleep phase disorder, for example, which the diagnostic criteria is regularly goes to sleep 2 or more hours after, is considered culturally appropriate. It's just about how you compare to the cultural expectations. That doesn't mean that they're not real, that these ways of observing people, these patterns, doesn't mean that they don't have some biological or other basis to them. It's just about how we diagnose. And in this book, in, for example, the section on ADHD, it says that while people with ADHD may struggle on tests of working memory or extended focus or executive function, I forget the exact phrases, but while people with ADHD may struggle with tests of these types, that those tests are not sensitive enough to be considered diagnostic indices, meaning we cannot use those tests to diagnose or rule out these conditions according to the DSM, which is the only place that labels what these conditions are. And yet everybody does it anyway. That doesn't mean it's a terrible thing and it's not worth doing or trying at all. I just want to be very clear about how full of contradictions this whole process is, how arbitrary it is. A lot of it, maybe almost all of it, comes down to the personal opinion and judgment of the person doing the assessment, giving the diagnosis, because these are universal experiences. You'll hear people sometimes say, well, everybody forgets their keys sometimes. Now we all have ADHD or whatever, something dismissive like that. Yes, we all forget things sometimes. We all lose track of time. We all struggle to get started or get disorganized sometimes, which is why all through this book, you will see the word significant, meaning that, sure, everybody forgets stuff, but if you are forgetting things in a way that is significantly negatively impacting your functioning, which is the word that this book uses, your functioning, then it counts as the diagnostic criteria. And just to make a little cherry on the top of this sundae, functioning as defined for the purposes of the DSM, I keep tapping this book and I have my noise canceling headphones. I don't know, maybe if that's loud. For the purposes of this book, functioning is referring to 4 categories: academic, occupational, social, and relational. That's it. There's nothing in here about subjective internal experience, which is why self-report isn't always taken as the final word, even though it really should be. Because how would anybody know if it's causing you significant distress unless you tell them? But they have their own opinions and they can disagree with you. So yeah, the insurance system and the medical system, the healthcare system, at least in the United States, which is where I live, I don't know a lot of details about others, forces us into this position where people are taking tests to diagnose or rule out a condition like ADHD, even though the only place that lists what ADHD even officially is says that you can't do that. Nobody cares. It's just how it is. This is why I'm saying tread lightly if you're thinking going for an official diagnosis. You can find this stuff online, by the way. The official diagnostic criteria for ADHD, the official diagnostic criteria for autism, you can find it online and you can compare. But I would suggest that if you are already thinking that you might be ADHD or autistic, good chance that it's useful for you to use that terminology regardless of whether or not you're going to qualify for the official diagnostics. Because in autism, for example, autism spectrum disorder is what the official diagnostic category here. Which, little side note, there used to be multiple different things: Asperger's syndrome, autism spectrum disorder, pervasive developmental delay, persistent, I don't remember, PDD. In the DSM-4, they switched to the DSM-5 in 2013, and they lumped all those together as just autism spectrum disorder. Same with ADD, attention deficit disorder, and ADHD used to be different disorders with separate diagnostic criteria, but they combined them. There is no ADD anymore, just ADHD, even though, funny, ADHD has inattentive type and impulsive hyperactive type and combined type. Meaning, if you have inattentive type ADHD, you don't have hyperactive symptoms, and yet hyperactivity is in the name of the condition. I hope I'm making it clear how confusing and frustrating and arbitrary this process is. Obviously, I'm trying to hit it a lot because people put too much faith in this. This is why I'm saying self-identification is valid and important. If anybody is saying, no, you must be diagnosed, they don't understand the process. One of the conditions, one of the symptoms that is required for a diagnosis of autism is social deficit. There are many, many, many people who will tell you that they are autistic and are fluent socially. Sometimes that's in the form of masking, which is costly and potentially even very damaging for people to do, but results in, from the outside, an observation of, wow, they navigate social situations fluently without a problem. In fact, many autistic people navigate social environments incredibly well. It can become a special interest and a hyper focus and a hyper fixation, and you learn everything about it, and you practice and you think, and you get really good at it. Anthony Hopkins is officially diagnosed with autism, a world-renowned actor. What kind of social debt? So just observations of symptoms, and you can look them up by yourself. So that would be my answer to you there. If you are struggling to get through your day, if your energy is getting drained, if you notice sensory sensitivities, you get overwhelmed and you shut down from sensory input, or just get overwhelmed and shut down, lose energy on some kind of frequent basis, it's not just a once in a while thing, then it's worth looking into whether or not you might meet these criteria. Separately from that, and we won't talk much more about this for the rest of the stream today because it's not the topic, but separately from that, I would highly, highly recommend to people to go online and find communities, autistic, ADHD, neurodivergent, whatever thing you're considering. Find communities of people who have those conditions, some of whom might have official diagnosis, some of whom might not, and learn from them. Because this is an evolving thing. One of the common jokey question, rhetorical things is, where were all the autistic people before 1940? Because we didn't have a diagnostic category we called autism before then. Everyone just all of a sudden magically appeared? Of course not. There have been people who have been autistic for who knows how long, probably the history of the entire human species. We just didn't identify those patterns and name it a certain way. And just literally less than 10 years ago, we used to categorize it differently. Asperger's, autism, PDD, and then we changed. This stuff changes. So that would be my answer to that. Men versus women, I will say women as a statistical thing, and again, in the United States, seem to tend to internalize symptoms at a higher rate than men, meaning for reasons that should probably be obvious to most people, socialization, basically. Boys, young boys and men tend to, when they're struggling with symptoms, struggle in some observable way. People can see the results because they don't face as much pressure to figure out ways to push past it at great internal cost, where girls and women have more of a tendency to be in an environment, to be socialized in such a way that the negative responses or punishments or whatever that they will receive for falling apart, quote unquote, in some kind of visible external way are so terrible that it's worth going through a lot more pain and discomfort and paying a much higher cost internally to appear and present on the outside as though everything is okay. So generally, you'll find more inattentive type for women and girls in ADHD, as an example. Women and girls, I know this is the 14th question on our list. What are the reasons that women and girls appear to be underdiagnosed? That's one of them, that they mask more. And not because women and men are fundamentally different in some way, but because there are greater consequences for women who fail to mask than there are for men. Think of the nutty professor archetype, for example. Very common thing. The man who is an eccentric genius, brilliant in his field and completely struggling with everything outside of it, socially incapable, and et cetera, et cetera. It's a common archetype that nobody has a problem with. Try and think how many times you've seen that archetype in any kind of media with it being a woman that's doing the nutty professor archetype. Anyway, What types of therapy or therapeutic interventions are most beneficial for individuals who receive a late diagnosis in adulthood? This is all over the place because it depends. It depends on the person, what they've been through, why they're coming to therapy. But I'll say some common things is there can be a lot of trauma to be worked through for people. Sometimes that trauma is part of the reason that people have learned to mask so well or have put so much energy into masking because of the trauma that they experience when they fail to mask in a way that somebody else has a problem with. It can be learning new ways, letting go of the idea that, for example, working on letting go of the idea that I am bad and broken and deficient, and just I am who I am, which is different than who other people are. And in some ways that causes me problems, but it doesn't mean that I'm bad and broken. And then I can let go of trying to be what everybody else is saying that I should be and start working on figuring out how to live a life that works for me. That would be my most generic. If you're going through a therapeutic process as a late diagnosed person, the big goal should be, probably more than anything, call it learning to unmask or whatever, but figuring out how to adjust your life, the environmental, the relationships, your ways, your strategies of navigating it, all of it, figuring out how to adjust the reality of your life to fit who you are. Because if you're coming to a late diagnosis, it is almost definite that you have experienced a long, probably lifelong experience of feeling as though you are doing a bad job, that you're wrong, that it's supposed to be easy. It's easy for everybody else. You're supposed to do this. That's supposed to work for you. It works for everybody else, but it's not working for me. And all that gets internalized on, I'm wrong, I'm bad, I'm lazy, I can't be, I have no motivation, I'm not ambitious, I am weak, I am whatever. It all gets internalized. And that's not helpful. You know that. You've been doing it. So I would say that whatever therapeutic approach you take, you're going to want to probably explore letting go of that, finding ways to let go of, I should be normal. I should change myself so that the things that work for everybody else work for me too. And instead focus on changing the things that are happening so that they work for me as opposed to changing me. And here's what will often happen. I see this all the time, is that people with a late diagnosis or who self-identify late in life, as adults, late in life, meaning 18 or older, they think that there is a set of rules now, because what their experience has been is, here are the rules, follow the rules, do it the right way, break things into small chunks and write it all down and plan it out, or just make eye contact, or whatever rules are that you have been told, that you have an experience of, those things don't work for me. People's first assumption tends to be, okay, those rules don't work for me, I need the other special set of rules for autistic people, or the other special set of rules for ADHD people, because those will work for me. That doesn't exist. Certainly, like I said earlier about going to those communities, there are ideas, there are strategies, there are tips and tricks, there are commonalities that make it more likely that certain suggestions, which commonly work for people who have ADHD or commonly work for autistic people, are more likely to work for you. But you are one person. Statistically, does not matter. It'll work for you or it doesn't. And people come in thinking, oh, great, now I know I'm autistic. And they'll come to a therapist, they come to us sometimes and say, cool, now I know I'm autistic, what should I do next? As though there's a generic, well, all autistic people need to do this, and then this, and then this, and then this. Because it's exciting. It's a sense of relief and validation to get that diagnosis or to self-identify, to say, oh, all these things that I thought I was just broken or bad, no, it turns out I'm just different. That's great. So now what do I do next? There's all this energy to move forward. And what do you do next depends. It depends on who you are and what you're trying to do and the context in which you're trying to do it. Great to look at things like, for example, medication with ADHD, which does benefit most people with ADHD who try it. So it's worth giving it a try. But all of this stuff, Like a very common ADHD hack, for example, is organize all of your things in such a way that they remain visible to you. That get a coat rack, a freestanding coat rack, instead of putting things in the closet, hang them up on a freestanding coat rack where you can see it all. Get a laundry hamper with a mesh bag that you can see the laundry in. Get a desk organizer so everything's on top instead of in drawers, because it makes it much easier to keep things where they are, remember that they exist, and get them out. That's not going to work for everybody. It works for enough of a high enough percentage of people with ADHD that it keeps getting put out there more and more as a suggestion, but it may not work for you. And if you're approaching this as there are a new secret set of rules that this is how everything works out for ADHD people, then when something there doesn't work for you, it's quite possible, if not likely, that you get thrown right back into all of that stress, all the relief and excitement that came when you got this diagnosis. Well, now, oh crap, the stuff that works for people with ADHD doesn't work for me, so I guess I don't have ADHD, or my ADHD is different or worse or whatever than everybody else. It puts you right back into, I guess I got to figure this out and I'm broken in some kind of a way. These are suggestions that are more likely to be helpful for you. But until you try them, you don't know if they are or are not. And if you try them and they are, great. And if you try them and they are not, great. It doesn't work for you. Move on and try something else. The one thing that we can say about anybody who identifies as neurodivergent, because we can't generalize really much of anything, the one thing we can say is they identify as neurodivergent, which means that they have a concept that they are different from the norm in some kind of significant way, which means that they have an idea that normal people operate or function in some different way from them. Typically, that will come out as people saying things like, I don't know all these rules that neurotypical people know that allows them to navigate small talk efficiently or communicate clearly, or etc. It all comes down to everything is easy for normal people, for neurotypical people. Everything is easy and it just works for them, and it's hard for me. Because there's truth to that, not the everything part, but obviously there are things that you're struggling with at some kind of higher frequency or intensity or some impact, more so than the general population, or you wouldn't be identifying yourself this way. It's not everything. And it doesn't mean that those people don't ever struggle, that they never miscommunicate or misunderstand some social custom or whatever. And it's important that we know that, because otherwise, are you upset about the fact that you can't fly through the air just by willing yourself to fly through the air? Probably not. If you genuinely believe that almost everybody else in the world could do that, and you are one of the few who cannot, would it bother you? A lot more than nothing. If we believe that there are some people for whom everything in life is easy, they never struggle, they never miscommunicate, then we want that. Why wouldn't we? If that's possible, why wouldn't I want everything in my life to be easy and to never have a problem? So as long as I continue to believe that that's possible, I want to figure out how to do that. I want the rules. But that's not what life is. That's not how it works. Those people, certainly there are patterns, right? That some things are easier for some people than for other people. Some people have lives that are much easier across the board than other people. And those people would still tell you that they have their own struggles and their own problems. I'm not trying to equate it and say everybody's the same and all that stuff, because that's obviously not true. Why would we be talking about neurodiversity if that's the case? It's just, don't fool yourself into thinking that there is some way to make it so that you never struggle or mess up or fail or have a problem or whatever ever again. There is not. You can do better. You can go longer in between problems. You can recover from them more quickly, identify them earlier on, etc. But there's not some new secret set of rules. Is it more difficult to receive? So what types of therapy and therapeutic interventions? It's about iteration. I highly recommend, obviously, we do our work the way that we do it here because we believe that that is most effective. I highly recommend bringing an awareness of executive functioning into the therapeutic work. That if you are autistic or an ADHDer, you're likely struggling with very real and specific things in your life, day to day or frequently, right? That I would suggest that it is worth looking for therapy in which those things will be addressed, not just exploration of the past and insight-based therapy, although that can be great. And for some people, even some late diagnosed or undiagnosed neurodivergent people, that will be better than what I do or anything else. That's the whole point. Different things work for different people. But I would encourage you to consider looking for something that will result in actionable things. Not that do this and it will work, that's the rule, but okay, let's explore this together and figure out what you're struggling with. Okay, let's explore it. Maybe this might work for you. Maybe there's a sensitivity involved. It could be something like this. If that was the case, then trying it this way might work better. So let's try that and see. But something to translate it into actual changes in your life. Yeah. Is it more difficult to receive medication for ADHD when diagnosed later in adulthood? No idea. I can't answer that question. I'm sorry. I don't know if there's like research on that. If there is, I don't know what it is. I would say it is more difficult to get diagnosed with ADHD in adulthood, later in adulthood. Once you have a diagnosis, I don't know that it's more difficult to get medication. I would hope that that's not the case, that if you've gone through that big process of getting an official diagnosis, which is extra difficult as an adult, I would hope that that's at that point the obstacles kind of decrease, the barriers drop a bit. But I don't know. If anybody knows, tell me. I'd like to know. Is it normal for adults with a late diagnosis to receive accommodations at their current workplace? So normal, just to be clear, the word normal just means most common. And obviously that's not the way that we use it in our culture. At least not always. Mostly normal means appropriate, good, expected, proper, whatever. But it just means most common. So in that sense, is it most common for adults with a late diagnosis to receive accommodations at their current workplace? Again, I don't know. I'm not aware of any research on that. If it exists, I would be interested to know. If any of you know, please let me know. But again, what I would say is it doesn't really matter for you as an individual. It doesn't matter if it's normal or not. What you want to be looking at is whether or not getting accommodations at your current workplace is viable, possible, beneficial, or too costly or harmful or potentially risky or dangerous, etc. So the answer to that question is going to depend a lot on your specific workplace. I would say there's an author, Dr. Devin Price, who's written a few different books. One is Laziness Does Not Exist. One is Unmasking Autism. And I haven't read them cover to cover. In fact, I own them. They're on my shelf back there, but I haven't read them at all. I'm not much of a book reader. But from my understanding, there are some more kind of practical step-by-step guides into how to approach employers to make discussions about this. It depends on your relationship with your employer. It depends on the scale of the organization that you're working for or with. It depends on a lot of things, but you're going to need to communicate about it one way or another. So I would say look into those policies, right? Find out what is available for people who do have official diagnoses, and do you need an official diagnosis to qualify for those things? Do you need to have accommodations written out on paper in some kind of official formal way that HR is going to look over and stamp? Or do you work at a small business where you can just talk to your boss and come up with some arrangements between the two of you? It depends. I would say anecdotally, I don't hear a lot about accommodations at the workplace. I don't hear a lot about that phrase being used, that term accommodations. That's usually when I'm hearing about that, we're talking about school. But many workplaces are flexible or supportive to some extent, at least anyway. And so we could call that stuff accommodations, right? Like adjusting your schedule to match your particular body and brain's way of working by working at home more often, or communicating differently in meetings or whatever. That those won't always be called accommodations, but it's about communicating with the people who would theoretically potentially have a problem with you doing it in the way that works best for you, which is costly and potentially risky and dangerous depending on who you work for. but also can be very easy and nice depending on who you work for. How do I go about telling my neurotypical partner that I'm now diagnosed with autism? Okay, that's a very loaded question, because what I would say is should be very easy. Shouldn't be that scary, shouldn't require that much preparation. If you are nervous about it, then either there are some things that need to be addressed in the relationship and in the other person's view of what autism is or what neurodiversity or neurodivergence is, or it's possible that they have no issue with it and you're just worrying about them reacting in some way that they wouldn't otherwise. It's possible. But if there's nerves around this, if there's anxiety around this, then that's what needs to be addressed. If you are autistic, you're autistic. If that label is useful for you, especially if it's an official diagnosis, but whether it is or isn't, if that's a useful label for you and you tell your partner about it and they react in any kind of negative way, then there's issues going on there that need to be addressed. In other words, if you have to think about being careful about how you present it, that means that you think there's a way to present it in which things will go well and a way to present it in which things will not go well. And if that's the case, then there's at least the possibility that they're not going to respond well to finding out that you're autistic. That might not be a good partner for an autistic person. And I know that it's not always easy to just break up and move on or divorce or whatever. But I'm saying, if you're nervous about it, the issue isn't about how you present it to them. The issue is in how they're thinking of the thing, autism, ADHD, whatever. That's the conversation that needs to be had. Now, having said all that, protect yourself. To whatever extent you're wanting to prepare, focus your preparations on protecting yourself from some potential negative response, not trying to manage the response or get a certain response from them. If they're going to be a jerk about the fact that you're autistic, you want to know that sooner than later. But you want to know it, you want to find out about it in the context in which it's not going to harm you, at least not any more than is possible. Because, on some level, it's going to harm you emotionally to find out that a partner thinks of you in that way. But that's where the work lies. So just protect yourself, tell them in a way that is safe, physically, emotionally, etc., as much as you can. And then let them react how they're going to react. Don't try to get them to react nicely. If you have to work hard to get them to react nicely to it, you're going to have to work hard to get them to treat you nicely for the rest of the relationship too. I would want to know. Probably not a very comforting answer, but I'm not here to help people figure out how to be more comforting to someone who has a problem with the way that they are. Your job isn't to be more comfortable for them to interact with, except to the extent that it keeps you safe. But that sucks. If you have to do that, that's not somebody you want to be intimate and vulnerable with. Now, people can change and they have different ideas of things and they can learn and you can educate them and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying it's a death sentence for the relationship if somebody's like, what are you talking about? You're not autistic or something like that. At which point you educate them, and again, depends on the relationship. How much is it worth going into all that? How receptive are they, etc. If you're going to go down that route, I would focus on talking about what it means to you, how it impacts you, what it means in terms of the things that you might think about changing moving forward, etc. Not what it is or is not, because people debate that stuff. There's relative consensus about some things, but there's nothing about it that is 100%. So it's kind of like if this same question was, how do I go about telling my cis partner that I am trans? It's a similar question. If it's that scary, then it might not be that they're a good partner for you. And it's not a terrible thing for one person who is impacted by, whatever, autism, being trans or whatever, to know more about it and explore and think more about it than a partner who isn't interested in that stuff. So there are times where it's fine and appropriate to be teaching them, educating them a bit, but there are limits, right? How hard is it and how worth it is it to continue to keep doing it? Can symptoms of ADHD become more or less manageable when entering adulthood? I don't exactly know what that means. Because symptoms are the, I don't know how to phrase this with the language of the question. I'll try and then I'll clarify. Symptoms are the unmanaged element of whatever way of being we're talking about. If you have ADHD and therefore struggle to remember, hold things in working memory, well, that impacts you in every way. Everything you've ever done, everything you've ever experienced, you've always been a person who struggles to hold things in working memory. And working memory is involved in pretty much anything that you consider consciously. So it doesn't change anything to be diagnosed one way or another. It's just a label to apply to something that's already been happening. And does it become more manageable when it, meaning if you struggle to hold things in working memory, you're still doing a lot of the things that you do just fine. Some things you struggle with or you miss or you get messed up in relationship or because of or contributed to by your struggles with working memory. And those things, the things that don't go well, are the ones we identify as the symptoms. So can symptoms decrease when you enter adulthood? Potentially. But if they do, it's either because as you grow, you're learning better ways to manage yourself and your tasks, right? That everything you experience, everything you do, everything you feel, perceive, everything is the result of an interaction between you and your environment. And as you grow, as everyone grows, we learn more about ourselves. We have more experiences. We learn more about our environments. We have more experiences to be able to draw on and compare things to. So you get better over time. Again, it's up and down. Certainly there are times where things are a lot worse than they used to be. But statistically speaking, over time, you get more experience, more attempts, more information, and you get better and better at learning how you work and coming up with ways to get through things that you need to do that work for you. So symptoms can decrease in that way, but it would be because you are approaching things differently or because your environment is different, not because some like fundamental element or aspect of you just shifts magically when you become an adult. Are the individuals, and I'll say too that a lot of the symptoms of ADHD and autism in particular, but all neurodevelopmental stuff, a lot of the symptoms are as judged by somebody else. Usually, if a child is getting diagnosed with ADHD, it is not because the child is saying, I think I might have ADHD. Usually it's because some adult is saying, wow, they're really having a hard time following the rules, or wow, they're having a really hard time remembering the things that I've asked them to do, or staying in their seat, or whatever. It's usually people on the outside who are negatively impacted by something that the child is doing, who then start the process of a diagnosis. That I'm sure that there are 6-year-olds who have said, I think I might have ADHD, but I think it's probably pretty rare. Yeah, I'm just repeating myself. I was going to say again that if you've made it to adulthood without being diagnosed, there's different variables there, but one that's likely is that you have managed your experience in such a way that it hasn't been bothersome to other people enough to do something about it. Are the individuals who have adult onset ADHD neurobiologically and genetically different than individuals who have ADHD that emerges up to age 12? We don't know. That's just as a general rule, really try not to think too much about anything you hear about genetics research. It's not presented to the general population in a way that would make any sense to genetics researchers. Unless you're a researcher or you really know that culture or doing a dive or talking to somebody like that, the version of what you're hearing about genetics is very reductive. There is nothing, for example, that genes cause. Well, I shouldn't say nothing. I'm talking about in regards to neurodiversity. There are correlations in genetic expression and yada, yada. It is all theoretical. It's all multivariate. Epigenetic things impact all this as well. There isn't, so we don't know. And it doesn't really matter for an individual. If we're doing research, like large scale research, then yeah. And people are looking into things like this, but we wouldn't typically call it, especially through the lens of neurodiversity, we wouldn't call it adult onset. we would call it late diagnosis, meaning you've always been that way. It just wasn't identified. It doesn't happen all of a sudden out of nowhere. If it does happen all of a sudden out of nowhere, that's where we get into differential diagnoses, which we'll talk about in a second. I got to move fast. I'm always too slow with these. In your opinion, what would be the best way to diagnose ADHD and or autism in adults? Self-identification. I think one of the things that is, to me, important if you're going to consider yourself as someone who believes in neurodiversity or is neurodiversity affirming, follows the paradigm. One of the things that is important there is an individual's report, their self-report of their own internal experiences is the final word on their own internal experiences. We can do analysis and we can say our theories and it seems like you're mad, it seems whatever. That's fine. Nothing wrong with that. But if they say differently than what you think, they get the final say. You don't know what's going on inside of them. They don't know what's going on inside of you. So if I could say what's the best way, like in an optimal utopian world, it's just purely self-identification. This is why I focus a lot on universal design, because we should not have to categorize, oh, well, this is how everybody gets it, and we'll modify it in these particular ways if you're autistic, but you have to go through this process to prove that it's necessary for us to. Universal design, it should just be everyone is an individual, everyone is unique. We listen to individuals about what works best for them, the language that they prefer to use, the things that cause them pain or bring them pleasure, instead of us from the outside making determinations about what that is. Do you think depression or anxiety in adulthood could be directly linked if you're undiagnosed with a condition? Absolutely, 1,000,000%. And there are some people who will say it the other way too, meaning some people will say, you don't have ADHD, you're just experiencing anxiety. And when you are anxious, it decreases your ability to function, executive functioning. It messes with recall and working memory and all these other things, and therefore appears as though it's ADHD. Some will say that. Some will say, no, it's ADHD that is then appearing as though it's anxiety. This is why I tried to hit it so hard at the beginning. This is not as simple and clear cut as people think that it is. It is not medicine. Different people have different opinions. So yeah, depression or anxiety absolutely could be linked. And you could say one causes the other or the other causes the other. It's up to you what you think is useful there. I will say that one of the things that I have seen a pattern of, and this is anecdotal, but I have seen multiple instances of this, is especially for adults who are pursuing official diagnosis, for some reason, it seems that medical professionals are much more willing to give a diagnosis of anxiety or depression and give medication for those things than to call it ADHD or autism. I've seen a lot more of people saying, no, it looks like ADHD, but really it's anxiety and you should take an anti-anxiety medication, than I have ever seen anybody say, no, it looks like anxiety, but really it's ADHD when it comes to the medical professionals. What are the most common differential diagnoses in late diagnosed adults? Again, I don't know common, like differential diagnoses, by the way, just as a term, it means these two diagnoses can appear similar. So we have to differentiate, what makes it so that it's ADHD and not anxiety, right? How do we differentiate those two? But yes, anxiety, I see a lot of in adults when they're looking for diagnosis, getting diagnosed as some form of anxiety instead. But I don't know what's most common. I can just kind of say anecdotally, I hear a lot about OCD in women, especially women, non-binary, femme presenting individuals. I see a lot of borderline personality disorder, bipolar. I think I said OCD. Potentially even dissociative disorders, definitely trauma, CPTSD. And again, you could make arguments that autism basically is CPTSD, or CPTSD is basically undiagnosed autism. People make these arguments, but these are other diagnoses that I see commonly related to, these conditions. How to work with your healthcare practitioner. By the way, I don't like personality disorders as a category of thing for reasons doesn't mean that they're not useful, and anything that's useful for people is useful and therefore good. But as a concept, the construct of your personality is in some predictable and semi-permanent, if not permanent way, problematic. Like, we don't locate it in anything other than this vague idea of your personality. Like, if I have borderline personality disorder, which is a disorder that is primarily identified by, revolves around the way in which I interact with other people, the way in which I navigate relationships. Well, in some of those relationships, you're going to see a lot of BPD stuff. In some of them, you're not. So how do we locate that all in the individual and not take into account what's happening on the other end of the relationship, as an example? Anyway, how to work with your healthcare practitioner, seek a second opinion if you think you've been misdiagnosed. I don't have a good answer for that. I don't know the healthcare system that well. I would say if you think you've been misdiagnosed, get a second opinion, but I don't know specifically how to do that. It would depend on your insurance and things like that, I suppose, finding another doctor. I always like talking. I mean, I like my doctor. If I didn't, he wouldn't be my doctor. Not everybody has that option to be able to try and kind of shop around for a doctor that you get along with. But if you have a doctor that you have a good relationship with, talk to them. If you think you've been misdiagnosed, explain to them why you think you've been misdiagnosed. Ask them what data, what evidence they would need to see to be convinced that you maybe have been misdiagnosed. Or what is these questions that I'm being asked about differential diagnoses and things, ask them those questions. And if you have a doctor that you can't really talk to like that, then consider finding a new doctor regardless of whether you think you've been misdiagnosed. And if you don't have that option, then I don't know what to say, because I don't know what options there are in the healthcare system, as in terms of like free clinics and things like that. I'm not an expert. I'm not up to date on specific options there. Sorry. Ideas for practical management of symptoms, traits while waiting on diagnosis. So yeah, but that's such a huge category. I mean, that's kind of what this whole stream is, right? Like, what symptom are we talking about? What trait are we talking about? And we can talk about a lot of practical ideas for practical management of those symptoms or those traits. So I guess look through our videos on YouTube or whatever. Going back, we have one on sleep and on cleaning your house and on all these different things. And if you have any that you don't see or you don't want to go that way, put questions in the chat. But there's not going to be a lot. This is one of those things I was talking about earlier. There is no answer to, across the board, how do I manage? What's a practical, specific way to manage all my symptoms? We need practical specifics about what the symptom is, what the trait is, to be able to give practical, specific, actionable advice on what can be done about it. There is no secret rule on how to be ADHD or how to be autistic. I guess I would say iterate. If something's causing you a problem, don't worry about figuring out why the problem exists. Just try and figure out what to do about it. If you're looking into why it exists, that's useful only to the extent that you're looking into why it exists in order to come up with ideas of what to do about it. If something works for you, don't worry about whether you need it or qualify or whether things are bad enough to be worth. If it works, if it helps, cool, keep doing it. If it stops working, come up with something new or modify it. Don't get stuck on trying to get yourself to go back to something that worked in the past. Context changes, you change, your environment changes. Things that work will stop working. Don't get hung up on it. Iterate, try something. Even if it works, try and modify it and see if it can work even better. You don't get to be done at this. That's not how life works, neurodivergent or not. There is no simple list or discrete set of skills that if you learn these things, you will never, ever have to learn and change and come up with new management techniques or strategies. You keep going. Try not to get too hung up on the fact that what might have worked for other people doesn't work for you, because it's not typically that helpful for you to spend that much time on that. It's valid and totally fine and can be very helpful to do that emotionally, to come to grips, reckon with that, process that, and how it's affected you. But in terms of practical management of symptoms and traits, thinking about how other people have it easier or things work for other people that don't work for you, not a lot of utility there. Just focus on what does work. And if you can't come up with something, then look for other people who know your experience or share your experience in some ways, or seem to anyway. Pros and cons of stimulant medication for ADHD, reasons to consider non-stimulant meds or non-medical treatment. I'm not going to talk pros and cons. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a doctor. I am actually specifically barred, as all therapists are barred, from giving any kind of advice about medication and whether someone should seek it or take it or not. And I'm happy to be barred from that, because my ideas don't really matter. You're an individual. If you're interested in it, talk to your doctor about it. If you're not, don't. I will say, medication or not, there are other things that can also be done. I take ADHD medication. I don't think it's a bad thing to do, but I don't just take ADHD medication and then everything's magically better and I don't have to work on anything else. Biology and medication, organic biological things are one thing that can help, but there are other things that can as well. So my recommendation would be, don't put all your hopes on just one thing. Don't leave it on just the even if the medication works very well for you, there's still other things that you can do to make it even better. And sometimes one of the best things about medication is that for some people, it can make it easier to then explore and implement some additional things to make it even better and better and better. What are reasons that women and girls appear to be underdiagnosed? A big one is what we were talking about earlier, internalizing symptoms. Another is that this all is cyclical. In other words, we developed the concept of ADHD. We officially diagnose some people as having ADHD, and then any research that we do on ADHD is done on the people who were diagnosed with whatever current knowledge we have. So ADHD and autism especially, but ADHD as well, both from the beginning have been primarily and predominantly diagnosed in young boys, and therefore all the research that needs an ADHD population and a control population of people who are not ADHD is primarily made up of young boys. And of course, there are statistical methods and research, processes to try and accommodate for that, but it all filters through. In other words, it's possible that theoretically anyway, how would we ever know? Because nobody exists independent of a social system and structure, but it is possible that for some reason, some way, somehow, it's not about socialization of that women and girls tend to internalize their symptoms more than young boys and men. It's possible there's some fundamental difference, but how would we ever distinguish that from the socialization piece? And if that was the case, could we just call that a different condition then, and blah, blah, blah? And it just, honestly, it's just boys get more attention. Boys get more support, statistically speaking. Not each individual boy, certainly, and not each individual girl. And of course, gender is a construct. And so boys and girls, I don't even like using that terminology, but obviously for the sake of simplicity, being able to have a conversation about any of this. Yeah, a young boy who is running around the classroom is more likely to get identified than a young girl who is struggling to control her racing thoughts. Their symptoms are more visible. Their symptoms cause more problems for other people. It sucks. It's not good. Also, it's not just those two demographics, boys or girls. White children are diagnosed with ADHD at a much higher rate than Black children or any non-white children. Black children in particular are diagnosed with ODD, which is a disorder that should not even exist. Oppositional defiant disorder. One of the diagnostic criteria for that is engages in behavior which annoys those around them. Literally in the diagnostic criteria, what annoys the people around you is part of that. Black children are much more likely to get diagnosed with ODD instead of ADHD. This whole thing, I've tried to be clear from the beginning. It's valid to the extent that it's valid. It's useful to the extent that it's useful. And it's just a bunch of people's guesses. I mean, I'm trying to open up a page here that lists all of the people involved in creating the DSM-5. Starting here, all these people here, which by the way, I forget the exact number, but it's something like 80 or 90+% of those people have some kind of financial tie to the pharmaceutical industry. Not that I'm a conspiracy theorist, but there's a reason that people in the pharmaceutical industry would want to make sure that certain things are taken into consideration when it comes to the official documentation that insurance uses for these different disorders and the treatments. None of these things are what they are. They're what could be agreed upon. They're the consensus of all of those people. Each one of those individuals that contributed to the creation of this book would give you a different idea. They would give you their idea, their opinion of what something is. And it will be different than what the book says, because what the book says is what the consensus was. So it's good to the extent that it's good. It's useful to the extent that it's useful. It's valid to the extent that it's valid, meaning if it helps you, if it's useful for you, great. And it is very, very useful for very, very many people. And it is incredibly flawed. It is not the final say on what a person's experience is, or what are all the possible ways we could categorize human experience, or ways of being, or particular experiences of symptoms. Or we will come up with more, we'll get rid of some, we'll combine some. Honestly, my personal belief is that at some point we will shift to just looking at symptoms instead of trying to gather symptoms together under categories of things. But it's flawed. You're an individual. There are problems with this that are important problems because they matter in terms of large-scale research and treatment options and structures, and those things need to be addressed. But you're not that person. You don't need to address that. You just need to find out what's useful for you. And I would say, please don't give up on something that seems useful to you because this book or some doctor says that that's the case. You go to one doctor, they'll say you have ADHD. You go to another, they'll say you have anxiety. They can't even agree on it. So don't abdicate your responsibility and your power to find things that are useful for you and explore and label yourself in ways that are useful for you to somebody else who doesn't know you and doesn't really care. Now, if you're involved in the large-scale stuff, the making of the book and all that stuff, then that's a different issue. But I don't think that's who we're talking to. I got to get going. I'm way late. Good to be with you. I will be back, I think, same time next week. But if not, we'll announce the change, I guess, and we'll always at least rebroadcast during this time. Thank you all for being here. Talk to you then.